I'm going to continue my video series on Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons by revisiting a parable that I discussed in a previous video. And I'm sure you're going to remember this one. Okay. Here's what we have. We have a father and two sons. The father goes up to the first son. He says, look, we got some problems in a vineyard over here, and if we don't clean this up right now, it's going to be a worse problem than ever before. We got to do it today. It's just got to get done. The first son was like, are you kidding? It's a beautiful day. You know where I'm going to go? I'm going to go to Timbuktu. I'm going to drink down a ton of fruit juice, and I'm going to bask in the sun all day. Well, the father, in desperation, he goes to the second son. He says, look, I got to have your help right now. We got a vineyard that's in a mess. And if we don't clean this up immediately, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be a worse mess than ever before. And the second son was like, sure, I'll help you. So what happened to these two sons? Well, let's go to the first one. This first one starts heading off for Timbuktu. And then he starts thinking to himself, you know what? I think I'm making a big mistake. So he turns around, goes to the vineyard, and does all the work. Well, what about the second son? Well, the second son starts heading to the vineyard. But as soon as his father turns around, this second son sneaks away, goes to Timbuktu, drinks a ton of fruit juice, and basks in the sun all day. Who served his father better? The first or the second son? The first. But the parable goes on. But before I tell you the rest of it, let me tell you this. Who was Jesus talking to? Okay. Jesus was talking to Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Who were these guys? Well, as you know by watching this video series, and if you watched my channel long enough, you know that these guys were the religious leaders of the first century. They had come out of Judea, they had come to Galilee, they came directly to confront Jesus. Okay, that's who these guys were. Now, Jesus made another statement to these people. Right after he told this parable, he said, look, he said, harlots and publicans are going to have a better chance of getting into heaven than you. I'm like, what? Why? Well, first of all, what's a publican? A publican was a tax collector. And these were, according to most people, the scum of the earth. Wait a minute, scum of the earth? Oh yeah, they were hated worse than harlots. They were hated worse than thieves. They were hated worse than liars. That's who these publicans were. Okay, they were basically the scum of the earth. Now, how does the scum of the earth, like a harlot or a publican, have a better chance of getting into heaven than these religious leaders? Here's why. The harlot and the publican still had a conscience. They knew they were the scum of the earth. And some of them actually went up to God and said, look, you have no reason to forgive us, but we want your forgiveness anyway. God likes to hear things like that. So does Jesus. Well, what about these religious leaders? They were so full of piety that they thought they were doing absolutely nothing wrong. And outwardly, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were on the outside keeping the Ten Commandments pretty good. Here's the problem. It was their thought life. That they weren't controlling very well. They were slime balls on the inside, even though they weren't slime balls on the outside. God knew this. Jesus knew this. That's why Jesus would have nothing to do with them. That's why he said, harlots and publicans are going to have a better chance of getting into heaven than you. The piety of these religious leaders was going to be their downfall. And Jesus knew this. Now some, like Paul, changed their path, and when they did, they became Christians. The ones who didn't, get the picture? Okay. Actually, what really became the problem was that because these religious leaders had perfected the technique of not breaking the Ten Commandments on the outside. They were actually lying to themselves. They were saying, hey, we're that good of a person. We don't need God. God's going to love us when we get to the kingdom. He'll just let us right on in. Boy, are they in for a shock. And they were in for a shock. God was like, yeah, right, I'm going to let you in? Your own piety has destroyed you. No way. Okay. Now then, let's give you a few extra notes on this. Alright, so, there are some people, some Christians in some churches that go to the extra effort of puffing themselves up. How do they do this? They start gossiping about their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. That's right. To puff themselves up, they start gossiping about their brothers and sisters in Christ. So in effect, they're destroying the lives of the brothers and sisters for the sole purpose of puffing themselves up. God knows this. Jesus knows this. And those people don't get into heaven. There is no practical purpose in gossiping like that, except to puff yourself up at the expense of your brothers and sisters in Christ. And Jesus will confront you on that on Judgment Day. Okay? Now another problem that happens, and it goes something like this. Let's say we have a Christian. He used to be the town drunk, okay? But somehow he gets in communication with God and God helps him get out of that alcohol addiction. That's great, that's wonderful. But then this former alcoholic becomes unsympathetic for those that are still suffering and struggling through alcohol addiction. The former alcoholic loses all of his sympathy. God notices things like that. So does Jesus. You think that guy's going to have a good chance of going into heaven? Not really. See what I mean? Now then, recently there was a video series. It wasn't even a series, it was just a video that had popped up on YouTube. And one of the things they were discussing was why Christian marriages fail almost as much as non-Christian marriages. Well, it goes back to this. You say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, one of the reasons why marriages like that fail is because that the two people involved, the bride and the groom, okay, before they ever get married, they never ask God if that's the person they're supposed to marry. They never bother to talk to Him. Matter of fact, there's a lot of things they don't talk to Jesus about. You know what happens with these people? When they get into a crisis, then they talk to God. Then they talk to Jesus. But when they're having a perfectly good day, they never talk to God or Jesus. Either one. Okay? They don't do that. Does that describe you? Think about it. You wake up this morning, you have clothes on your back, you have food on the table, your house is still standing, your car is still running. And it's a beautiful sunny day. Do you ever go up to God and say, hey, look, thank you for giving me a beautiful sunny day. Thank you that I still have my job. Thank you that I still have my house, and I still have my car, and I still have the clothes on my back, and thank you for this delicious food. Do you ever do that? How quickly we forget to do things like that. If you don't do that on a regular basis while you're here on this earth, guess what happens? You get into heaven, and Jesus is like, well, you didn't talk to me down there. Why would I talk to you now? I don't even know who you are. We didn't get to know each other down there, so why am I bothering you now? That's when he says the words, I never knew you. And that's why. Part of the reason why that Christian marriages fail is because the bride and the groom did not ask God who they were supposed to marry before they went down the aisle. That's part of it. But here's another part. It's about your job. Okay? All too often, Christians believe in continuity. They believe that things are going to work out the same way 30 years from now as they do today. There are very few things in life that have continuity. Yes, the sun will still always come up in the morning. Technically. Okay? The earth will continue to spin around the sun. That's continuity. The moon continues to spin around the earth. And of course it has its own orbit. That's the kind of continuity we're talking about. Okay? There are very few things in the world that are that form of continuity. Don't count on being in the same job 30 years from now that you are in today. Now you say, where does continuity become a problem? Well, continuity becomes a problem when all of a sudden the business you're working for closes its doors and you don't have a job anymore. That's when it becomes a problem. So you can't rely on continuity. Okay? And when you can't rely on continuity anymore, you can't pay off the mortgage, so the house isn't yours anymore, and the car isn't yours anymore. And everything in your life starts getting repossessed. And that creates fights between you and your spouse. And that's what busts up a lot of marriages. And it's all due to the fact of your lack of education. Now, this is something I often see in churches. Not all of them, but I do see this in churches. And I see this way too often. You know what they'll tell you when you walk in the door? Bible's the only thing you ever need. Here's the problem with that. You can whip this right back at them. Really, Bible's the only thing you ever really need in life. If that's the case, where is it in the Bible that it teaches you how to read? I've been through every book of the Bible. It doesn't teach you how to read. How are you supposed to read the Bible if you can't read? It doesn't work that way. Where in the Bible does it teach you any form of arithmetic? How are you going to be a cashier anywhere if you can't perform basic arithmetic? Where is it in the Bible that gives you a complete discourse on how to operate the internet? It's not in here. How can you be an accountant if you know nothing about accounting? How can you be a master mechanic when you know nothing about cars or boats or anything like that? If you can't fix a light switch, how are you going to be an electrician? It doesn't work that way. The Bible is the center of your education. What do I mean by that? Because this teaches you how to keep a moral compass. It teaches you how to do the right thing even when you're tempted to do the wrong thing. This book will teach you how to get along with human beings and how to get along with God. This is your moral compass. That's the center of your education. Let me tell you something. If you manage to acquire yourself a good reputation, this Bible will teach you how to maintain that good reputation, because your good reputation can get you into a new type of job in case the business that you're working for suddenly closes. You have to maintain your reputation. Okay? If you have a good reputation, maintain it, because when you lose that, you're in big trouble. You lose your good reputation, you could also end up losing your job. And you can find it really difficult to get another one. And that's the truth. But like I said, a Bible will give you a good moral compass. A Bible will teach you how to relate to God. It will teach you how to relate to human beings. But it will not teach you is how to fish. Give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach him how to fish, and he eats for a lifetime. I believe in that. If you want to know how to become a doctor, this will give you your moral compass for being a doctor. But what this will not teach you, there's no part in here which will teach you step by step how to perform a surgery. It's not in here. That's not in here. Okay? That's the difference. The Bible has to be the center of your education, but it is not all your education. And I know something else that happens in churches a lot. Because there are Christians in churches that don't like to get involved in people's lives. This is a fact. Let me tell you something. If somebody comes to you with a problem, don't just suddenly hand them a book. If they were wanting to consult a book, they would have gone to the library. They came to you. You help them with the problem. Don't just throw them a book and say, hey, go read this and it'll fix all your problems. You tell them how to fix their problems. If you want to read that book together with them, that's okay. But don't just hand them a book and say, hey, go shove off. Because what you're doing in essence is the same thing in the parable of the Good Samaritan. You remember that? Oh yeah. The first two guys that see the injured man, they say, I'll pray for you, and they walk on. Jesus doesn't approve of that. Jesus only approved of the third guy who stood there and took that injured man to an inn and had him cared for until he got better. That's the difference. There's your answer. If you ever have a Christian that comes up to you and you tell him your problem and he says, I'll pray for you, read this book, you know when you turn around to him and you say, you're no better than what was described in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you go find yourself another Christian to hang out with. And if nothing else, you can come over here because I will get involved. I'll walk you through your problem. I'll do my best to tell you what you need to do about it. I can't say I'll give you perfect advice, but I'll tell you what I know. But I'm not going to just hand you a book. Look how many videos I've posted. I've posted almost 3,200 videos. Did I just suddenly hand you a book and say, hey, go learn this? No. I said, I'll teach you. And that's what I do here. That's the difference. Now, that's a lot of things to think about. So, remember these things. Number one, don't let piety fill you up so much in life that you think you're doing nothing wrong, because the very second you think you're doing nothing wrong is probably the time when you really are doing something very, very wrong, and you need to deal with it. Do not use gossip in a church to puff yourself up at the expense of your brothers and sisters. Don't ever do that. Okay? And just because you're successfully able to purge yourself from an addiction doesn't mean that you can then go and judge somebody who hasn't quite made it yet. You can be compassionate to these people and still help them out of their addiction. You don't have to approve of their behavior, but you still have to love them. Okay? Do not fall into the erroneous belief of continuity. The belief in continuity is what busts up a lot of marriages. Don't take things for granted, especially jobs. Remember to keep the Bible as the center of your education, but also remember to get education beyond this. Okay? Remember, if you're wanting to become a plumber, get a book on how to fix a sink. Nowhere in here does it teach you how to fix a sink. It's not in here. Okay? The Bible is the center of your education, but it is not all your education. Before you ever walk down the aisle, you make sure to consult with God and make sure that's the person He wants you to marry. Because if it isn't, you're going to be in a terrible situation. Also remember to keep up constant good communication with God. Don't just communicate with Him when things are bad. You communicate with Him when things are good. Then He can say, well, I knew this guy because he talked to me on a regular basis. Okay? Don't get it to the point where Jesus is standing up there at Judgment Day saying, I don't know who you are. Don't ever do that. Okay? And don't let finances bust up your marriage. Let me tell you something. All marriages will have some kind of financial hard times, but you don't have to live in perpetual poverty. That's the difference. You can have a financial hard time without being totally impoverished. It doesn't have to be that way. If you have any comments or questions, leave them down here in the comments below. I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.